Hello, and welcome to Gestalt IT.
Hi, I'm Khalid Raza, Distinguished Architect at Cisco and one of the two co-founders of Viptela.
My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I am a network analyst here at Gestalt IT, focusing on all things networking, including SD-WAN. Khalid, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to someone who's very distinguished in the area of SD-WAN. I mean, we've heard a lot about Viptela over the years. We were super excited to see the acquisition by Cisco and where they've really been taking the technology. So thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know that with Cisco Live going on this week, things have been hectic. And of course, you know, we're doing this interview over Zoom because the current situation that we're faced with all over the world has necessitated some additional networking expertise. So thank you again.
Thank you.
I want to start off with a question. What do you see as the value of SD-WAN in the enterprise as more companies begin to adopt cloud strategies, especially given the current situation that we're in with the pandemic?
So if you look at the basic premise of SD-WAN, anything we've done in networking technology, especially in the wide area, is based on our data models. When we went to MPLS, because of unified communication. We needed ubiquitous any-to-any connectivity in the data plane. Now, if I start to see what cloud is doing to SD-WAN and generally to my wide area, we're moving away from a data center to centers of data. And those centers of data are not at a fixed location, that at any arbitrary point. So from SaaS to infrastructure as a service to platform as a service, and I categorize them, each one of them separately. So when I look at SaaS, if I go to consuming a SaaS, most of the responsibility of protecting the data, protecting security elements lies on the hands of the SaaS provider. If I'm going to O365, Salesforce, they provide that level of granular security. The minute I go to infrastructure as a service, that becomes a very interesting challenge. When I, being the networking guy, my applications were designed in the times of there was a very well-defined perimeter. Nobody focused that much on how deep security I need to have, how much encryption. You'd be surprised that the customers I work in, major corporations, still have 64-bit encryption. The minute you put a 64-bit encrypted packet on the internet, I can break it in 30 minutes. They come back to the networking guys and says, you need to protect. When I go to major cloud providers, they'll say, I'll protect up to my hypervisor, anything above that you protect. So from that perspective, that arbitrary locations where my data is going to sit, network becomes major element to protect that data. And that is where separation of control and data becomes extremely important from the perspective of connectivity. I can connect at any arbitrary point, but I spin up my data workload, but my network policy has to be centralized. So my branches don't see the effect of my workload moving. They can quickly converge and connect to it. So in a multi-cloud world, each one of them requires a much more elegant, smart, intelligent fabric. So fabric understands where my workload is and quickly pivot towards the new location of the workload. It could be in a single cloud, and deeper you go into a cloud, you would be in multiple locations. Even within AWS, you have multiple availability zones. So even within those availability zones, as my workload moves because of compute, my fabric needs to know where the workload is, and my branch needs to connect to it most optimally. So when we were building Viptela, that was primary use case we were focusing on. We were not focusing on our hybrid WAN. We said that's a byproduct of a fabric construct we need to build. And edge is going to become even more important tomorrow. So I'll go into it when we go into some other topics. But if I look at it, this arbitrary connected fabric where your data is going to move and the data will move faster, that becomes a very key piece for the SD-WAN and looking future of the wide area networks in general.
And I'd say that you probably have succeeded beyond your wildest dreams with this concept of using fabric, because even before the acquisition by Cisco, Viptela had positioned itself to be one of the primary cloud on-ramp providers. You know, for those folks who are still trying to figure out, well, how do I get the data delivered safely to the data center? You know, Viptela was able to step in and say, guess what? We have a solution for that. And extending that with a company that the reach that Cisco has is a great way to kind of quickly increase your footprint. Now, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned in that discussion about data and analytics. And I know that as we're learning now with the advent of software-defined networking, analytics has a huge role to play in the network, specifically with SD-WAN, because SD-WAN is not only a huge consumer of analytics, but it's also a huge provider of analytics as well, kind of like you mentioned. You know, how do you see the role of analytics in networking changing in the coming months or years? What can analytics provide us that we don't already have today?
So if you look at it, that's the beauty of coming back to Cisco. When we were focused on the wide area side of the problem, we were collecting data about flows, information that's going inside of my network. Now, more recent integration with Umbrella. We have one of the largest non-governmental database from security perspective. So if I have information, I know vulnerable locations. If I have a day zero attack, I can understand what's flowing in my network, anything that changes in my predictability of my application flows. Now I can do gray pathing, which were never there from security perspective. So the more data I have, the more understanding I have, all of a sudden, as my path is flowing through a very defined application flows that I have in my network, I see any anomaly. I can quickly bring up compute in a cloud location and start dumping that data and analyze, because one of the things that security guys are most nervous about, they hate black and white. Either I permit or deny. If I can create a gray path and say exactly what's going on in this network, and I can transform that data back into my data center if it's a legitimate data. If it's not, then I can push it back into Cisco's larger security ecosystem. And after analysis, I can bring this back. So data analytics, machine learning, this whole AI, from not just from networking perspective, not just from SD-WAN data flow perspective, from security perspective of Cisco. And Cisco's recent announcement of Thousand Eyes makes me even more interested from the perspective. It makes it much more interesting proposition there, because now I know what's going on my underlay. Now, prior to that, if I had an overlay and I saw inefficient performance of my application in my network, I would pivot to most alternate service. In a lot of cases, people were trying to hide the problem of overlay not knowing what's going on in the underlay by unnecessarily duplicating data. If I have the intelligence of Thousand Eyes, I can know exactly at what point there is an event at the service provider. If the congestion is about to happen, I can trigger that intelligence back into Viptela, and Viptela can actually reroute that problem before I notice any failures. So having the predictable understanding, having the application profile, having the understanding of the data flows, having this large security ecosystem, this is about, again, the beauty of SD-WAN and the beauty of this whole intelligence system. I can do preemptive things over my network, which is all about data, because data is the next oil. The more data I have, the more intelligence I have in the system, and says, I can react to failures, I can understand failure, I can at times predict failures. And when I'm doing this predictive analysis, and over a period of times, if I see a certain behavior on my network, I can reroute my traffic around it. I can reroute my traffic around the overlay failures. I can reroute my traffic now around underlay failures. So from security to analytics to understanding of overlay, underlay, application profile. That's why I feel Cisco is in one of the best positions to create this whole ecosystem, which is not just centered around networking, which is centered around your data and your applications.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with you there. I was super excited to see the acquisition of Thousand Eyes, because we've talked to Thousand Eyes at Tech Field Day before, and the data that they provide is not only very genuine and very actionable, but integrated with a larger framework can really help you out quite a bit. And you know, as soon as the acquisition was announced, I was sitting at my desk and I go, that makes total sense, and I can't wait to see what they do with it. So that to me is the essence of being able to deliver fresh, valuable analytics to someone who can make good decisions about them.
And
so, yeah, preemptive decisions, thinking ahead. So absolutely. I want to pick up on something you and I were talking about before we started the interview. One of the areas that you say that you're very heavily invested in is IoT. And we've been hearing a lot about that, IoT and where the new edge of the network is. Obviously, SD-WAN has a huge role to play in this, but it's not what most people think about when they think of what IoT is, because I mean, most people will probably think that my thermostat is talking to my refrigerator and asking my toaster to make a bagel. But you came up with a very interesting use case that's very relevant to the current situation that we're in. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about kind of where you have been heavily involved in IoT as of late.
So as I've been talking to medical IoT providers, they're always in the plan, how do they transform the healthcare industry? COVID completely accelerated those new business models. If I look at what is happening, non-critical surgery, I've known people, actually I was talking to my wife about it, she has a friend who's been waiting for surgery for over 6 to 8 weeks now, because if it's not a non-critical surgery, you can't go back to the hospitals because of COVID situation. So a lot of ambulatory providers are still providing services to their patients. In fact, if you look at the United States, there are about 380,000 ambulatory providers providing services for primary care. So the non-critical surgery will gradually transition towards ambulatory services. It's much more cost effective, but that is where the health IoT just takes off. Because now you have a setup, you have an environment where somebody needs to perform a surgery, but it's not at the level of a hospital care, but it's a non-critical surgery. So more and more IoT providers will provide these non-critical surgery as a service. So that as a service model is a very interesting proposition from the from cost perspective, and also moving elements in times of pandemics. Because you can't stop people, somebody who has a knee problem, you can't continue their suffering for months just because hospitals are not a safer place to send people. But your ambulatory locations are that are not handling COVID patients. So that opportunity, I would say, is tremendous from healthcare perspective. So the other setup that I'm involved in is the manufacturing side of it. This whole idea of digital twin. Now, if the digital twin is a complete digital copy of your factory floor, so somebody who's not essentially at the location, and it's a smart critical worker, will be able to access data at the edge. Now you see the theme evolving. When we were building the internet, that entire architecture was built around client-server model. This is more evolving towards peer-to-peer model because the data source is now at the edge. The data has to be handled, and you can't just push raw data back into cloud location. You have to convert that into information. Once that's converted into information, then you source that data, and that data source is single, but the destinations are multiple. It's going to multiple, the original manufacturer of that equipment, that company that is utilizing that equipment. So from a hospital setup, the clinician who's doing the surgery to the hospital system that it's virtually part of, that data goes back to different sources. So it's a very, very different model and disruption happening from the IoT perspective. And that's why the control has to be at a single point. You decide who, when gets access to what data, because it's becoming a lot more peer-to-peer than a client-server model. Edge will grow much faster than our current cloud models will. So from that perspective, if 75% of the data would be at the edge, how and who consume that data? It's a very, very interesting problem. And that is where, how do you control that information flows? And actually, when we were building the Viptela architecture, we had this, that it will be a multi-domain communication. So if you look at Viptela control plane, it has the ability to connect multi-domain. It's not implemented yet, but the identity of domain was there in part of our framework and architecture, because it's going to become a lot of multi-domain transactional data models.
See, this is why you need to talk to a distinguished architect when it comes to solving your challenges, because it sounds like you've put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into this. And these are things that people may not even understand are capable of being done right now. And that's kind of the vision for this technology that has me so excited. Is it's not just connecting, getting rid of an MPLS circuit and adding some broadband in a branch. It's all of these exciting possibilities that can be driven by edge computing. But speaking of branch, I'm coming to you live from my new branch office, which is, well, it's my house. We are starting to see a lot of changes in the way that people do work now, because they are basically going to have to start working from home more seriously. And working from home means it's time to toss out some of those consumer devices that we've been using for a while. Do you see SD-WAN playing a huge role in this transition to the, well, let's just call it the home branch, of being able to provide extra services? I know that when everybody in my house gets on a video call at the same time, somebody's going to suffer, and I would really like it not to be the people who are paying the bills.
Actually, SD-WAN has become a very interesting proposition from work from home perspective. And again, if you look at it, I have application profiles, and you're absolutely right. When my daughter is watching Netflix, I do not want that to disrupt my primary call that we're having. So from that perspective, if I have application profiling and I can carve out segmentation within my home, what segmented traffic goes and what segment has a higher priority. So I become the barrier of the traffic exiting my house, because I can do much more granular level of control, and isolate before it leaves my network. Because ultimately the first stop as we go into this consumer space is going to be the public internet. And we all know there is no quality of service once the data leaves my house. So from that perspective, I create segments, and within each segment, I control the security before it exits. And then on top of it, the applications. If I am sitting home and O365 closest location is closer to my home, I'd rather take that than to backhaul that data back into my corporate. The user VPNs are still very static. From that perspective, I have to make the user-based VPNs much more dynamic based on application profiling. So all of a sudden, I have 3 or 4 or 5 data flows. One is going back to corporate, which is over my VPN, which is could be IPsec or SSL, or it could be going to O365, or it might be going to AWS, where I'm running infrastructure as a service for my compute purposes. So from that perspective, again, my source is a single point, but my destinations are multi-point. And those multi-point could be a layer 3 tunnel, could be a transport over the public internet. I can take an O365 connection. So from perspective of connectivity, all of a sudden my granular visibility, the application flows, connections, number of endpoints that connect in much more distributed fashion is going to be very critical. I have to prioritize my data, I have to segment the data, and I have to find the best location which serves my data because the cloud is coming closer to me. So if it's coming closer to me, then the decision point from control policy perspective has to be single. But the data policy should say, wherever is the most optimal path, you go and you connect. And that's why Cisco's Cloud On-Ramp and Cisco Cloud Fabric makes us very, very intelligent, because I might be in a location where I might be getting service from a low-end broadband provider whose DNS peerings are not efficient. So what might be happening, that data might be sitting, and I'm in San Jose in Portland, but because of their peering, I might be going back to New York. From Cisco's perspective, since we have an intelligent system, the entire fabric knows where actually all these exits are, and say your better exit is at a colo in San Francisco, where you do have a cloud on-ramp. Go there. Don't take your direct internet exit because your provider doesn't have the efficiency to tell you what is the best place to serve this data. So having that intelligent, again, going back to my fabric point, the fabric is intelligent. Fabric tells where, what location, what performance. You can't blindly rely on the public internet to say, I will take you there based on the capability of the transport provider. So from the perspective of the Viptela architecture, we had these concepts in mind. We were building this architecture day one from a cloud fabric perspective and IoTs, not just cost savings of MPLS, because over a period of time, I think those cost savings start to become irrelevant. You innovate for the data models, you don't innovate for circuits.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's changing from that traditional mentality of circuits and hardware to data models and software is a challenge that we're trying to solve. But thankfully, I mean, we have really accelerated digital transformation. I've seen Twitter polls, you know, what is your digital transformation driver? And they all seem to be now leaning toward, you know, external factors. We'll just put it that way. But, you know, how do you see that digital transformation accelerating across the enterprise, being driven by these new ways of thinking about things, thanks to, you know, the technology that we've developed that allows us to look at these things in a different perspective?
So the digitization is both from the perspective of networking and application. Having the complete understanding of the applications that from app dynamics point of view. So getting data from your applications, getting data from your network, understanding that whole system, where those applications are being created, how those applications are created, how those applications are consumed from enterprise perspective. As I earlier mentioned, there is a complete market that is a multi-billion-dollar market just for a digital twin in the manufacturing sector. So how that application will be consumed, created, how do I transition over a period of time? Now, if you look at this architecture that we're building for overall system, I have a single or few control points, and I can start my digital transition gradually by location basis, and says, these are the applications, these are the profile I create, this is the test environment I'm creating, this is the data that will be created and consumed from that location. And then once I've created that element, then I will see the impact of it. So from that transition into that whole digital world where I have my whole remote edge connected, where I have my remote compute connected, where I might report remote application generating data, where they're consuming it, how they're getting distributed, how they're getting being uploaded, handled. And that whole setup gives us the time to go to our digitization journey in a very gradual fashion. Traditionally, when we have looked in networking aspect, and that's one of the complaints I've made to the SD-WAN industry, everybody talks about pure automations. Automation, and I love this quote from Bill Gates. He said, automation done to an efficient system increases efficiency, and automation done to an inefficient system increases inefficiency. So if you take a path of just automating some of these traditional technologies the way we build, it's going to take a long period of time to create these point-to-point connections and transition into this fabric I keep on talking about. So as we're going to this digital transformation, we need to have a much more intelligent fabric, and edge starts to become smarter and smarter, because edge is now the data source. Edge is my creation of applications. So how that data is going to be created, how its data going to be consumed in multi-cloud location, which providers I select, which provider provides me a better analytics to do that data modeling for the application testing or digital transformations I'm doing. That's how it's going to become very, very critical from the aspect of how do we take this digital journey. And in Cisco, we're luckily is in one of the best positions. We have the complete infrastructure support. We will provide you application support. We will provide you security. So if you put that whole ecosystem together, any new transition you're trying to go to, we have the tools to provide you, and we give you the ability to create that systems virtually in cloud. Once you're satisfied with it, then you can move it into your regular IT systems and consume it for your businesses that you actually want them to be utilized for. So it's a very interesting journey from our perspective, from Cisco's perspective, because every element that connects to a network goes through Cisco. And we're sitting in the path. We give you intelligence how to handle, consume, and create that path.
Oh, I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself, because you really understand kind of what the genesis and the reasoning behind digital transformation is. And I completely agree with you. All right, so you've made some pretty good bets in the past. You've understood where things need to go. So I'm going to ask you to put on your futurist hat for a minute. What do you think the standard enterprise network is going to look like in, say, 5 years?
So I think the standard enterprise network would be a lot more data at the edge, extremely distributed cloud, and there is no perimeter, but you have a virtual perimeter. So your perimeter, which was physical, is now going to become virtual. If I show up as a user, consumer, I am a data consumer, and I am also a data generator. Anytime I generate a data, any location generates a data, that is gold for somebody else who wants to consume that data. So I feel it's going to be extremely segmented, multifaceted, micro-segmented VPN transactions that will be going on for me to consume and create data. From that perspective, there is no perimeter, but there is a strong virtual perimeter, which is centered around security and application visibility, application control, all the data models that we're going to create as a user, as an enterprise. So my perimeters are gone. My user is a smart user, which is consumer of data, creator of data, lot more expectation of peer-to-peer communications, lot more expectation of any free-flowing data, but with very tight granular control of security and policies, because I can't disrupt my policies. And that's why, in my opinion, the SD-WAN's basic premise was state abstraction. If I abstract this whole state of how the policy would be implemented before the data flow happens, I have the policy implemented, I can do any transaction as granular as possible. So I don't see, I expect, and that's an interesting study by McKinsey, that the 30% of workforce might not even come back to branch locations. If I'm not coming to branch location, I am a branch location now. I want to consume all the applications exactly the way I was consuming earlier in my, when I was sitting at a branch. All those applications, all those flows. So I have much more distributed edge and much more distributed data centers. So it's a very large amount of scalable any-to-any connections. I talk to my customers, when I was talking to them pre-COVID, they used to tell me, oh, I don't have to worry about scale. because I just have 100 branches. And I said, today when I talk to them and says, how many people do you have working for you as a corporation? 5,000. I said, all of a sudden, you have 5,000 branches. All of them would require that data. And all of a sudden, your data, which is residing in a cloud provider, would not be sitting in a cloud provider. So see the scale all of a sudden you changed from 3 data centers to 2 cloud providers to multi locations inside of a cloud provider, multiple cloud provider, multiple employees distributed across. So a medium-sized branch is now would be handling the scale of a large corporation. From that perspective, this architecture matters the most, in my opinion. People have overlooked architecture of SD-WAN by saying, I can create a traditional IPsec tunnel and connect you to your workload. That is not going to scale. And that's the fabric. It becomes extremely important. If 2 executives are talking, I wouldn't mind encrypting their data peer-to-peer. From that perspective, it's a massively scale distributed problem. And I've been a routing guy all my life because I build the MPLS network, I build the internet core. As a routing guy, I'm going to go a geek on you for 30 seconds. As a routing guy, the only largest distributed database system that we have connecting everything on the internet is a massive scale routed fabric. And we need to look at that scale exponentially growing. And it's going to be any to any. And the enterprise will have to understand that scale. Today, you were okay not understanding the scale. Tomorrow, you will be forced to understand the scale.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that scale is going to be our biggest problem. As we've learned, even in just these last 4 months, massive scale can happen when we least expect it. You can go from 7 branch offices to 700 overnight. And
Exactly.
so, I would tend to agree with you. I mean, obviously, co-founder of a very successful company, distinguished architect for another very successful company. I think you may have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. So, Khalid, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your perspective and your expertise in this. This was a great conversation, and I can't wait to see, where things go in the future. Honestly, I'd love to get back together with you in 5 years and see if this paid off. I'm sure that we'll be talking again pretty soon, though. So, thank you very much. For those of you out there who are watching this interview, thank you for joining us as well. If you want to find more great conversations like this and more great discussions around technical topics, please make sure you check out gestaltit.com. Or also our event series at techfieldday.com. But for now, thank you for watching.